The sleepy town of Copper Ridge sat quietly beneath a blazing summer sun, its dusty streets nearly empty except for the occasional passerby. Sarah Mason, a 22-year-old college student, had decided to spend her summer break visiting her father, John, a retired Navy SEAL who had settled in the peaceful community after decades of service. She loved the simplicity of Copper Ridge, where time seemed to slow, and people greeted each other with warm smiles. But on this particular day, the stillness of the town belied the trouble brewing beneath the surface. Sarah pushed open the creaky door of Ruby's Cafe, the local hangout spot. She enjoyed coming here to sip coffee and read, finding solace in its rustic charm. Today, however, her plans for a quiet afternoon were interrupted when two strangers walked in. The men, clad in leather jackets and worn boots, had an air of menace about them. Their names, as Sarah would later learn, were Drake and Mason, two outlaws with a reputation for stirring trouble wherever they went. She barely noticed them at first, engrossed in her book, but it didn't take long for them to notice her. Drake nudged Mason and nodded in her direction, a sly grin spreading across his face. They sauntered over to her table, their heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. "Hey there, sweetheart," Drake drawled, leaning against her table. "What's a pretty thing like you doing all alone in a place like this?" Sarah glanced up, startled but composed. "Just reading," she replied curtly, hoping her lack of interest would send them away. Instead, they chuckled, clearly enjoying her discomfort. "Reading, huh?" Mason sneered. "How about we give you some company? You look like you could use it." "I'm fine, thank you," Sarah said firmly, her voice steady but her heart pounding. Their persistence was unnerving. The other patrons in the cafe seemed hesitant to intervene, their eyes darting nervously toward the confrontation. Sarah decided it was best to leave. She packed her book into her bag and stood, but Drake stepped into her path, blocking her way. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his tone mockingly sweet. "We were just starting to get to know each other." "I said I'm fine," Sarah repeated, her voice sharper now. "Please move." The cafe door opened, and a figure stepped inside, a tall man with a commanding presence. It was John Mason. He had stopped by the cafe to grab a coffee on his way home, but froze when he saw the scene unfolding. His sharp eyes took in every detail, Sarah's tense posture, the way the two men loomed over her, the way her hand gripped her bag tightly. John's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Is there a problem here?" Drake turned, his smug expression faltering as he sized up the newcomer. "No problem, old man," he said with a dismissive wave. "We're just having a friendly chat." "That's my daughter," John said evenly, his tone calm but laced with authority. "And it looks like she doesn't want to talk to you." The room fell silent. Sarah exhaled in relief, stepping to her father's side. Drake and Mason exchanged glances, their bravado momentarily shaken. But then Drake smirked, deciding to push his luck. "Relax, we were just being friendly," he said, backing away slightly. "Didn't mean any harm." John's eyes narrowed. "Friendly isn't what I'd call it. Leave now." For a moment, it seemed they might escalate the situation, but the steel in John's gaze made them think twice. Without another word, they turned and left the cafe, but not before Drake shot a parting glare at Sarah. "We'll see you around," he muttered under his breath. John placed a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder as they watched the men disappear down the street. The other patrons rocked, the tension dissipating, but John remained on edge. He knew trouble when he saw it, and those men reeked of it. "Are you okay?" he asked Sarah once they were outside. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Thanks for showing up when you did." John's jaw tightened. "They won't bother you again." But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Outlaws like Drake and Mason didn't take kindly to being confronted, and their parting words hinted at unfinished business. As father and daughter walked home, John silently resolved to be ready for whatever came next. Unbeknownst to them, Drake and Mason stood at the edge of town, watching them disappear into the distance. Drake lit a cigarette, his eyes cold and calculating. "The old man's tough," he said, exhaling smoke. "But nobody makes a fool out of me." Mason grinned. "Let's teach them both a lesson." The stage was set, and the peaceful town of Copper Ridge was about to become the backdrop for a deadly confrontation. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting Copper Ridge in shades of deep orange and purple. John Mason stood on the porch of his modest home, sipping a cup of coffee, his eyes scanning the dirt road leading into town. His instincts were on high alert. Years of service as a Navy SEAL had trained him to notice even the smallest signs of trouble, and tonight, the air felt heavy with tension. Inside, Sarah tried to shake off the unease from her encounter at the cafe. She sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a magazine, but her mind kept drifting back to the Outlaws, their smug grins, their threatening words. It all felt too deliberate. Her father's presence had been a relief, but she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that they weren't done with her. "Dad?" she called out. John stepped back inside, placing his coffee on the counter. "Yeah? Do you think they'll come back?" she asked, her voice quiet. John hesitated, not wanting to alarm her. "People like that don't like being told no," he said finally. "But if they do, they'll regret it." Sarah nodded, trusting in her father's confidence, but the pit in her stomach remained. Later that night, as the town fell silent, John heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. He stepped to the window and saw the faint glow of headlights moving slowly past his property. He knew immediately who it was. Drake and Mason weren't the type to let things go. John grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, his sharp eyes scanning the perimeter. The vehicle had already disappeared into the distance, but he noticed something unusual near the gate. Walking closer, he found a crumpled beer can and a cigarette butt, the kind of careless litter that didn't belong here. His jaw tightened. They were marking their presence, testing him. He picked up the can and the butt, tossing them into the trash. "Amateurs," he muttered. The next morning, Sarah woke to find her father already outside, inspecting the yard. She joined him, her brow furrowed as she noticed him hammering something into the ground near the gate. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Reinforcements," John replied, not looking up from his work. "Just in case." Sarah crossed her arms. "You think they'll really come here?" John straightened, meeting her eyes. "I don't think. I know. People like them always escalate. The question is whether we're ready for them." His words sent a chill down her spine. She watched as he continued his work, setting up what looked like simple barricades and reinforcing the locks on the doors. It reminded her of the stories he used to tell about his missions, how preparation was the difference between life and death. Meanwhile, Drake and Mason were holed up in a rundown motel on the outskirts of Copper Ridge, nursing their bruised egos. Drake paced the room, his face a mask of fury. "That old man humiliated us," he growled. "Made us look weak." Mason leaned back on the bed, flipping a knife in his hand. "So what? Let's show him who's boss." Drake stopped pacing, his eyes gleaming with malice. "We will. But we're not just going after him. We're going to scare the hell out of his daughter first." Mason grinned. "I like the sound of that." As the day wore on, John's preparations intensified. He set up motion-activated lights around the property and ensured his old but reliable hunting rifle was clean and ready. His training had taught him that defense was as much about psychology as it was about physical barriers. The more prepared he appeared, the less likely his enemies would risk confrontation, or so he hoped. That evening, Sarah tried to go about her routine, but the tension was palpable. As she washed the dishes, she glanced out the kitchen window and froze. Two shadowy figures stood at the edge of the property near the fence. Her heart raced as she dropped the plate in her hands. "Dad!" she called out. John appeared in an instant, his expression hardening when he saw the figures. "Stay here," he ordered. Grabbing his flashlight, he stepped out onto the porch, his presence commanding. "You're on private property," he called out, his voice steady but firm. "Turn around and leave." The figures didn't move for a moment, but then one of them spoke. "We're just admiring the view," Drake said mockingly. "Nice place you got here." John stepped down the porch steps, moving closer. "You've got 5 seconds to leave before I call the sheriff." The second figure, Mason, chuckled. "Go ahead. Not sure he'll get here in time." John's eyes narrowed, and he raised the flashlight, illuminating their faces. "You really want to test me?" The tension was thick as the two men hesitated, but finally they turned and walked away, laughing quietly to themselves. John stood there for a long moment, watching until they disappeared into the darkness. Inside, Sarah stood by the window, her hands trembling. Are they gone? For now, John said as he re entered the house. But this isn't over. That night, as Sarah tried to sleep, John sat by the window, his rifle resting against the wall beside him. His instincts told him the outlaws would strike again, and next time, they wouldn't just be testing his patience. The following morning, the rising sun bathed Copper Ridge in golden light, but the unease lingering over the Mason household cast a shadow on the day. John Mason had barely slept, his sharp instincts keeping him alert to every creak and rustle of the night. Sarah, too, wore the weight of the previous evening's encounter, though she tried to mask her anxiety with a brave face. At breakfast, Sarah pushed her eggs around her plate. "Dad," she began hesitantly, "do you think it's safe here anymore?" John looked up from his coffee, his piercing gaze steady. "It's safe as long as we make it safe. That's why we're not going to wait for them to act again. We're going to stay ahead." Sarah frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," John said, setting his cup down with a calm precision, "I'm going to prepare for them like I would any other threat, and you're going to be ready too." John's preparations began in earnest that day. He spent hours surveying the property, making mental notes of its vulnerabilities and strengths. His military background kicked into high gear as he marked potential entry points and laid out a plan. Motion sensors, he muttered to himself, jotting notes on a pad. Floodlights here, barrier reinforcement there. He made a trip into town, visiting the local hardware store, where the owner, an elderly man named Hank, greeted him warmly. "Mason," Hank said, leaning on the counter. "What brings you in today?" "Need some supplies?" John replied, handing him a list. Hank scanned it and raised an eyebrow. "Looks like you're fortifying a castle." John gave him a faint smile. "Just some precautionary measures." Hank chuckled. "You always did have that military mindset. Still, can't be too careful these days." As John loaded his truck with supplies, he noticed a familiar pair of figures lingering near the corner of the street. Drake and Mason. They didn't approach him, but their smirks and whispered comments were enough to set John on edge. He drove home with a renewed sense of urgency. Back at the house, John wasted no time setting up his defenses. He installed motion-activated floodlights around the property and placed reinforced locks on all doors and windows. Sarah watched him work, feeling a mix of awe and apprehension. "You're really serious about this," she said, handing him a wrench. John paused and looked at her. "Sarah, when you've seen what I've seen, you learn to take every threat seriously. These guys aren't just bullies. They're dangerous, and we're not going to let them win." Sarah nodded, her respect for her father deepening. She had always known him as a strong and disciplined man, but now she was witnessing the depth of his resolve. That evening, John gathered Sarah in the living room for what he called a quick lesson. On the coffee table sat an assortment of items: a flashlight, a whistle, a small canister of pepper spray, and a folding knife. "These are your tools," John said. "If anything happens and I'm not around, you need to know how to protect yourself." Sarah picked up the pepper spray, turning it over in her hands. "I've never used anything like this." John nodded. "That's why we're practicing. Come on." He led her outside and set up a target on a tree, showing her how to aim and deploy the spray. At first, Sarah was hesitant, but under John's patient guidance, she quickly got the hang of it. "Good," he said, nodding in approval. "Now, remember, your first priority is to get to safety. Use this only as a last resort." Sarah felt a surge of confidence. For the first time since the outlaws had appeared, she felt like she had some control over the situation. As the sun set, John reviewed the footage from the cameras he had installed around the property. The images showed nothing unusual, just the swaying trees and the occasional passing car. Still, he knew better than to let his guard down. Around midnight, the motion sensors activated, and the floodlights bathed the front yard in harsh white light. John was instantly on his feet, rifle in hand. He checked the monitors and saw two figures lurking near the gate. "It's them," he muttered. He moved quietly through the house, ensuring Sarah was safe in her room before stepping outside. The outlaws hadn't entered the property yet. They were testing his defenses, pacing along the edge of the fence. John decided to send a message. Without warning, he flipped a switch, activating a loud alarm that echoed through the night. The outlaws startled, their heads snapping toward the house. John stepped into the light, his silhouette imposing. "This is your first and only warning," he called out. "Get off my property." Drake and Mason hesitated, clearly unnerved, but their pride wouldn't let them back down completely. Drake shouted back, "You can't hide behind your lights forever, old man." John didn't reply. He simply stood his ground, the rifle in his hands speaking louder than words. Finally, the outlaws retreated, disappearing into the darkness. Inside, Sarah met him at the door, her face pale. "Are they gone?" "For now," John said, his voice calm but firm. "But this isn't over." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll be ready." As the house settled into silence once more, John knew the confrontation had only just begun. But he also knew one thing for certain. The outlaws had underestimated him, and that would be their biggest mistake. The quiet of Copper Ridge's night carried a deceptive calm as John Mason sat on his front porch, a faint breeze stirring the desert air. His mind was a storm of calculations, weighing every possibility, every outcome. He had faced danger many times before, but this time the stakes were different. This was about protecting Sarah, his daughter, the one person he couldn't bear to lose. Inside the house, Sarah tried to distract herself with a book, but her thoughts kept returning to the ominous figures lurking at their gate the night before. She admired her father's calm resolve, but couldn't shake the fear that even he might not be able to handle what was coming. "Dad?" she called hesitantly. John stepped inside, setting his rifle by the door. "What is it?" She hesitated, then asked, "What was it like, when you were a SEAL? Were you ever scared?" John pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his expression softening. "Fear's part of the job, Sarah. It keeps you sharp, makes you think before you act. But you don't let it control you. You use it." She nodded, absorbing his words. I don't want you to get hurt." John reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. "Sarah, my job now is to protect you. That's all that matters." The next morning, John set to work reinforcing their defenses. He had already installed motion detectors and floodlights, but now he added subtle tripwires around the property, small, nearly invisible, but effective enough to alert him if someone crossed them. He also prepared an escape route for Sarah, a hidden path that led from the back of the house to a dense thicket. "If things ever get out of control," he told her, "you take this path and don't look back. Got it?" Sarah frowned. "I don't want to leave you." "You won't have to," John said with quiet confidence. "But I need you to know the plan. Always have a plan." Meanwhile, Drake and Mason were holed up in their motel room, their anger simmering. They had underestimated the old man, but now they were determined to show him who was in control. "That guy thinks he's untouchable," Drake growled, pacing the room. "We'll see how tough he is when his precious daughter's scared out of her mind." Mason leaned back against the wall, flipping a switchblade in his hand. "So what's the plan? We go in, rough them up, and leave?" Drake smirked. "We go in, leave our mark, and make sure they never forget us." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John prepared for the night ahead. He double-checked his equipment, ensuring everything was in place. His military instincts told him the outlaws would strike soon. They wouldn't let their bruised egos rest for long. Sarah joined him on the porch, her arms crossed against the cool desert air. "Do you really think they'll come back?" John's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Yes, and when they do, we'll be ready." He handed her a whistle and a flashlight. "If anything happens, you blow this as loud as you can. It'll give me enough time to get to you." Sarah took the whistle, her fingers trembling slightly. "I wish this wasn't happening." "So do I," John said quietly. "But sometimes we don't get to choose our battles." As the night deepened, the motion detectors lit up the front yard. John's heart quickened as he checked the monitor. Two figures moved cautiously along the edge of the property, Drake and Mason. He grabbed his rifle and gestured for Sarah to stay inside. The outlaws seemed emboldened, testing the tripwires and prodding at the fence. John watched from the shadows, his Navy SEAL training taking over. He moved silently, positioning himself strategically to observe their movements. When Mason crossed one of the tripwires, a tin can rattled, breaking the stillness. "What the hell was that?" Mason hissed. Drake scowled. "Relax. He's just trying to scare us. John's voice cut through the darkness like a knife. You're on my property again. Leave while you can. The floodlights blazed on, illuminating the outlaws. Mason instinctively shielded his eyes, while Drake pulled out a handgun, aiming it toward the house. You think you're tough, old man? He shouted. Why don't you come out here and face us? John stepped forward, his rifle steady. Drop the gun, or this ends now. Drake hesitated, the tension crackling in the air. You don't have the guts to shoot, he taunted. John's calm response sent a chill down their spines. Try me. The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity, but then the sound of distant sirens broke the silence. Drake and Mason froze, realizing they were out of time. With a curse, Drake lowered his gun, and the two men retreated into the darkness. John didn't relax until he was sure they were gone. He turned to Sarah, who was watching from the window, her face pale but determined. Are you okay? He asked. She nodded. What about you? John gave her a reassuring smile. They're not done yet, but neither are we. As the sirens faded into the night, John knew the battle was far from over, but with every passing moment, his resolve grew stronger. The outlaws had picked the wrong fight, and soon they'd learn just how dangerous a retired SEAL could be. The morning sun bathed Copper Ridge in light, but the lingering tension weighed heavily on the Mason household. Sarah watched her father as he sipped his coffee at the kitchen table, his eyes scanning the newspaper, but clearly focused elsewhere. His movements were deliberate, each sip and page turn betraying his mind's preoccupation with the looming threat of Drake and Mason. Dad, Sarah ventured, breaking the silence. What happens now? They're not just going to leave us alone, are they? John folded the newspaper neatly and set it aside. No, he said simply. They've already shown us who they are. Men like that don't stop until they're forced to. The firmness in his voice gave Sarah a strange mix of comfort and unease. She knew her father was capable. His Navy SEAL past was proof of that, but she worried about how far he might have to go to protect them. Later that day, John decided it was time to gather more intel. He drove into town, stopping by the sheriff's office. Sheriff Daniels, a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor, greeted him with a firm handshake. Mason, Daniels said, leaning back in his chair. Heard you had some trouble with those two drifters. More than trouble, John replied. They've been on my property twice, and last night one of them pulled a gun. Daniels frowned, his fingers drumming on his desk. Drake and Mason. We've had our eye on them since they rolled into town. Small-time criminals, mostly, but they've been getting bolder. Then why haven't you done anything? John's tone was measured but sharp. Daniels sighed. They haven't crossed any legal lines we can prove. Trespassing, sure, but nothing that would stick in court. We're stretched thin as it is. John's jaw tightened. If you won't handle them, I will. Daniels raised a hand. Hold on now, Mason. I know your background, and I know you can take care of yourself, but we don't need vigilante justice here. This isn't about justice, John said coldly. It's about protecting my daughter. Daniels studied him for a long moment before nodding. Fair enough. Just keep it clean. Meanwhile, Drake and Mason were busy planning their next move. Holed up in their rundown motel room, they had spent the morning nursing bruised egos and plotting their revenge. I'm not letting some washed-up soldier make a fool out of me, Drake snarled, slamming his fist on the table. Mason, always the quieter of the two, smirked. So, what's the plan? Scare him? Or finish the job? Drake lit a cigarette, his eyes narrowing. Both. We hit him where it hurts. Mason's grin widened. The daughter. That evening, John returned home with a sense of foreboding. He shared what he'd learned with Sarah, who listened intently, her expression shifting from fear to determination. Is there anything we can do to stop them? She asked. We prepare, John said. They're predictable, and that's their weakness, but we need to be ready for anything. John spent the rest of the evening reviewing the footage from his cameras. As he rewound the tapes, something caught his eye, a flash of movement near the edge of the property, hours earlier. Zooming in, he spotted Drake and Mason lurking in the shadows, clearly scouting the area. They're getting bold, he muttered. The night brought with it a heavy silence. John patrolled the house, his steps light and deliberate. Sarah, too anxious to sleep, stayed in the living room, clutching the whistle her father had given her. Every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind sent her heart racing. Around midnight, the motion sensors activated, flooding the yard with light. John sprang into action, grabbing his rifle and checking the monitors. This time, the outlaws weren't just testing the defenses. They were inside the perimeter. Drake and Mason moved with practiced precision, cutting through a section of the fence and making their way toward the house. John watched their every move, noting their weapons. Drake carried a pistol, and Mason held a crowbar. John grabbed his radio and whispered into it, "Sarah, stay in your room. Lock the door." "But, Dad..." "Do it. Now." Reluctantly, Sarah obeyed, barricading herself in her room. John slipped out the back door, moving silently through the shadows. Years of SEAL training had taught him how to become invisible, and tonight it served him well. He positioned himself near the tool shed, waiting for the outlaws to come closer. When they did, he acted. A sharp whistle pierced the night as John activated a nearby trap, a series of cans and wires that created a deafening clatter. Startled, Drake and Mason turned, their weapons raised, but John was already on the move. "Show yourself," Drake shouted, his voice tinged with frustration. John's voice echoed from the darkness. "You're out of your league, boys." A moment later, he stepped into the floodlights, his rifle aimed squarely at Drake's chest. The outlaws froze, realizing too late that they had underestimated him. "This is over," John said, his tone ice cold. "Drop your weapons and leave, or you won't walk out of here." Drake hesitated, his finger twitching on the trigger. "You don't scare me." John's expression didn't waver. "Then you're dumber than you look." The sound of sirens in the distance finally broke their resolve. Drake cursed under his breath, lowering his pistol. Mason followed suit, tossing the crowbar to the ground. "Get out," John ordered, "and don't come back." The outlaws retreated into the night, their humiliation palpable. But John knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. The tension in Copper Ridge reached its peak as another hot, restless night settled over the town. John Mason sat in his dimly lit living room, rifle resting against the wall beside him. Every instinct told him tonight would bring the confrontation he had been preparing for. The question wasn't if, it was when. Upstairs, Sarah paced her room, unable to sleep. The events of the past few days had left her on edge, and she couldn't shake the fear that Drake and Mason weren't finished with them yet. Her father's calm exterior gave her some comfort, but even she could sense the storm brewing beneath his steady gaze. Around midnight, the motion detectors activated, flooding the yard with harsh light. John's head snapped up as he grabbed his rifle and checked the monitors. The cameras revealed Drake and Mason creeping toward the house, their movements deliberate and calculated. John quickly radioed Sarah. "Stay in your room. Do not come out until I tell you it's safe." "Dad, please be careful," she replied, her voice trembling. "I will," he assured her, his tone firm and unwavering. He moved swiftly, positioning himself at the back door. He had spent years in the field, and his Navy SEAL training kicked in as he prepared to outmaneuver the intruders. He knew their overconfidence would be their downfall. Drake and Mason approached the front porch, their weapons drawn. Drake carried a pistol, and Mason wielded a crowbar, his knuckles white from gripping it tightly. They exchanged a glance, their expressions filled with malice. "This ends tonight," Drake muttered. "The old man and his brat won't know what hit them." They crept onto the porch, but as Mason raised his crowbar to smash the window, a deafening alarm sounded, startling them both. Floodlights illuminated the yard, and the sound of rustling bushes signaled that they were no longer alone. "What the hell?" Mason hissed, spinning around. John's voice echoed from the shadows. "You've got one chance to leave. Drop your weapons and get out," Drake snarled, raising his pistol. "Show yourself, you coward." John stepped into the light, his rifle trained on Drake. His calm, commanding presence immediately shifted the balance of power. "I'm right here," he said. "Now drop the gun." Drake's finger hovered over the trigger, his face twisting in defiance. "You think you can scare us? We don't take orders from anyone." "Then you've made your choice," John replied, his tone icy. Before Drake could react, John fired a warning shot into the ground, the deafening crack of the rifle shattering the night. Mason flinched, his crowbar clattering to the porch as he raised his hands. Okay, okay, Mason stammered. We'll leave. But Drake wasn't ready to back down. You don't have the guts to shoot us, he sneered, taking a step closer. John's expression didn't waver. Try me. The sirens began faintly in the distance, growing louder with every second. Drake's bravado faltered as he realized the sheriff was on his way. He spat on the ground, his face a mask of rage. This isn't over. Oh, it's over, John said, his voice steady. You just don't know it yet. The sheriff's vehicles pulled up moments later, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow across the yard. Sheriff Daniels stepped out, his hand resting on his holstered gun. Mason, he called, stand down. We'll take it from here. Drake hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of his situation. Finally, he tossed the pistol to the ground and raised his hands. The deputies moved in, cuffing both men as Daniels approached John. Looks like you had things under control, Daniels said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. John lowered his rifle. They weren't going to leave until someone stopped them. Daniels nodded. Well, they're done now. We've been building a case against these two for months. This should put them away for good. As the outlaws were hauled into the sheriff's vehicles, Sarah emerged cautiously from the house. She ran to her father, her face a mix of relief and worry. Are you okay? She asked, scanning him for injuries. I'm fine, John assured her, pulling her into a protective embrace. It's over. For the first time in days, the tension lifted. The danger had passed, and the Mason family could finally breathe again. That night, as the house fell silent, John sat on the porch, staring out at the desert horizon. Sarah joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. You always know what to do, she said, handing him a cup. John smiled faintly. Not always, but I've learned to trust my instincts. Sarah sipped her coffee, her gaze thoughtful. I don't know what I'd do without you. You won't have to, John said, his voice soft but firm. No matter what happens, I'll always be here. The desert wind whispered through the trees as father and daughter sat together, the bond between them stronger than ever. The battle was over, but the lessons they had learned would stay with them forever. The sun rose over Copper Ridge the next morning, casting long golden rays across the quiet town. For the first time in days, the Mason household felt at peace. John stood by the kitchen window, watching the gentle sway of the trees outside. The chaos of the past few nights seemed like a distant memory, though he knew its impact would linger. Sarah entered the room, her steps lighter than they'd been in days. Morning, Dad, she said, her voice soft but steady. John turned to her with a small smile. Morning, kiddo. How'd you sleep? Better, she admitted, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Feels good knowing those guys are finally gone. John nodded. The sheriff said they've got enough to keep them behind bars for a long time. Sarah exhaled deeply, as if finally releasing the weight she'd been carrying. Thank God. As the morning wore on, neighbors began to stop by, offering their thanks and support. Ruby, the owner of the cafe where it all began, arrived with a basket of muffins. John, she said, setting the basket on the kitchen counter. You're a damn hero. This town owes you. John waved her off. I'm no hero, Ruby. I just did what had to be done. Ruby's eyes softened. Well, whatever you call it, we're grateful. Those two had been terrorizing people for months. You stood up to them when no one else could. Sarah watched the exchange, pride swelling in her chest. She had always admired her father, but seeing the way the community respected him brought a new level of appreciation. Later that day, Sheriff Daniels stopped by to give John an update. Drake and Mason are in custody, he said, leaning against the porch railing. Turns out they've got a rap sheet a mile long. Assault, theft, you name it. This was the break we needed to put them away for good. John nodded. Glad to hear it. Daniels studied him for a moment. You know, Mason, not everyone would have handled things the way you did. Most people would have let fear win. But you didn't back down. John shrugged. Fear's a part of life. It's what you do with it that matters. Daniels smiled. Well, if you ever decide you're tired of retirement, the department could use someone like you. John chuckled. Thanks, but I think I'll stick to my porch. As evening fell, Sarah and John sat outside, the cool desert air wrapping around them. The stars began to emerge, dotting the sky like tiny beacons of hope. Dad, Sarah said after a long silence. Do you ever miss it? The seals, I mean. John leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. Sometimes, he admitted. There's a sense of purpose in it, knowing you're part of something bigger than yourself. But that chapter's closed. My mission now is here. Sarah smiled, her heart full. You've still got that purpose, you know. You've taught me more about strength and courage these past few days than I ever thought possible. John glanced at her, his eyes softening. You've always been strong, Sarah. You just needed a reason to see it. They sat in companionable silence, the events of the past few days slowly fading into memory. For Sarah, the experience had been transformative. She felt more confident, more capable, and more connected to her father than ever before. In the days that followed, Copper Ridge began to return to its usual rhythm. The scars left by Drake and Mason's reign of terror were healing, replaced by a newfound sense of community. People spoke of John Mason in hushed tones of admiration, his bravery becoming a symbol of resilience for the town. Sarah, too, found herself changed. She no longer saw her father as just a retired Navy SEAL, but as a man whose strength came from more than his training. It came from his love, his wisdom, and his unwavering commitment to protect those he cared about. That night, as John sat alone on the porch, a faint smile played on his lips. The desert stretched out before him, vast and quiet, a reminder of both the challenges they had faced and the peace they had reclaimed. He knew life would bring more trials, but for now, he allowed himself to savor the victory. From upstairs, Sarah's voice called out, breaking the stillness. Good night, Dad. Good night, Sarah, he replied, his voice steady and warm. The stars shone brightly above, and for the first time in days, the Mason household was truly at peace. The days after Drake and Mason's arrest brought a quiet sense of relief to Copper Ridge. The once peaceful town that had been shaken by fear began to rebuild its sense of safety and community. John Mason had become something of a local legend. Stories of his bravery spread quickly, earning him the respect and admiration of his neighbors. For John, the attention was unnecessary. He had done what any father would do, but he couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing his actions had made a difference, not just for Sarah, but for the town he now called home. One morning, Sarah joined John on the porch, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in hand. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow across the desert landscape. Town feels different now, Sarah said, handing him a mug. John nodded, taking a sip. People are starting to feel safe again. That's what matters. She sat down beside him, her expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about everything that happened, about how I froze up when they came to the cafe, about how scared I was. That's normal, John said gently. Fear is human, Sarah. The important thing is what you do with it. She glanced at him, her eyes filled with determination. I don't want to be caught off guard like that again. I want to learn. Self-defense, preparedness, everything. John smiled, a mix of pride and relief washing over him. You've got a good head on your shoulders. I'll teach you everything I know. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and John worked together to transform their experience into lessons. John taught her basic self-defense techniques, how to remain calm under pressure, and how to recognize threats before they escalated. The training sessions became a bonding experience, deepening the already strong connection between father and daughter. Sarah's confidence grew with each lesson. She no longer felt like a victim of circumstance, but like someone capable of taking control of her own safety. It was a transformation that John had quietly hoped for, a strength he always knew she had, now fully realized. Word of John's actions began to spread beyond Copper Ridge. A local reporter interviewed him for an article in the town paper, and soon people from nearby communities reached out to thank him. One day, Sheriff Daniels approached him with an idea. Mason, Daniels said, leaning on the railing of the Mason porch. I've been thinking. We've got a lot of folks around here who could use someone to show them what you've been teaching Sarah. Basic self-defense, situational awareness, that kind of thing. What do you say? John raised an eyebrow. You want me to run some kind of class? Daniels grinned. Why not? You've got the skills, and people trust you. Could be good for the community. John considered it for a moment, then nodded. I'll think about it. The proposal planted a seed in John's mind. He had spent his life as a protector, first for his country, then for his family. The idea of extending that role to his community felt like a natural evolution. He began drafting plans for a workshop, drawing on his Navy SEAL training to create a program that was both practical and accessible. Sarah volunteered to help, suggesting ways to make the lessons engaging and inclusive. Together, they turned the idea into reality, hosting the first class in the town's community center. The turnout was larger than expected. Dozens of residents eager to learn from the man who had stood up to the town's most dangerous outlaws. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of John's actions became clear. Copper Ridge was no longer just a sleepy desert town. It was a place where people looked out for one another, where fear had been replaced with resilience. For Sarah, the experience was transformative. She found herself stepping into a leadership role, helping to organize and lead parts of the self-defense classes. Her confidence and poise inspired others, and she became a respected figure in her own right. One evening, as the sun set over the desert, John and Sarah sat together on the porch, watching the horizon. The glow of the community center lights flickered in the distance, a symbol of the strength they had built together. "Do you ever miss it?" Sarah asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Miss what?" John replied. "Your old life. The SEALs, the missions, all of it." John thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Not anymore. My mission now is here, with you, with this town, and honestly, it feels just as important." Sarah smiled, her heart full. "You're good at it, you know. Protecting people, teaching them." John chuckled softly. "I've had a lot of practice." They sat in companionable silence, the quiet hum of the desert filling the air. The stars began to emerge, one by one, painting the sky with their soft light. For the first time in a long while, Copper Ridge felt completely at peace. If this story inspired you, remember that resilience and courage can overcome even the toughest challenges. John and Sarah's journey reminds us of the power of family, community, and standing up for what's right. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and activate the notifications bell so you never miss another incredible story of strength and justice. Share this with someone who needs a little inspiration today.